Hello, thank you so much for joining us for the 50th edition of New Director, New Film. My name is Florence Helmosini. I'm a senior programmer at Film at Lincoln Center and this year co-chair, along with my colleague La Frances Louis at MoMA. New Director, New Film is our annual collaboration with MoMA and Film at Lincoln Center, and we're really excited to have the 50th edition this year. A quick note to add that New Director, New Films is supported by Film at Lincoln Center New Wave membership program, and Film at MoMA is made possible by Chanel with additional support provided by the annual Film Fund. And then without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce the director of the film Friends and Strangers, writer-director actually, James Vaughan. Welcome, James.
Hi, glad to be here.
You mean you're glad to be there?
I'm glad to be right where I am. Yeah.
Yeah. Friends and Strangers is your first feature film. You've directed a few short films before. It premiered in Rotterdam, and we're really delighted to show it with our American and New York audience. As a writer-director, maybe can you start easily by the origin of the project and how you started writing the film?
I started the film in probably around 2015. I'd been living in Melbourne for 3 years and had been working on a film that had been very, like co-directing a documentary that had found very difficult for a number of reasons, and actually the film was never released and just artistically never felt totally satisfied with it. Came back to Sydney a little bit vulnerable as as any kind of artist or filmmaker does after a project that doesn't hit the mark you want it to hit. And it was I felt like I was starting from scratch because it had been a few years since I'd made a short. And I didn't have a job, didn't have a house, and was sort of studying again as an adult in Sydney, which is a city I grew up in. And yeah, came to Sydney with fresh eyes, I guess. And the film was something that just grew out of the people I was meeting and in the work I was doing. Worked at a sort of like a floor staff member at a art gallery in Sydney, and was living close to the CBD. And yeah, the film was a reflection of a time and a place, I suppose, which felt very much like a period it's a period for people, I guess, after they finish university, particularly after having gone and studied something in the humanities, and coming from like a private school background in a pretty affluent, comfortable part of Sydney. I think a lot of people expect things to just go fine for them, and then in the mid to late 20s, there's a period of confronting a broader culture in Australia that's, in the one sense, very sort of skewed towards helping out white people, but in another sense quite hostile to a self-reflective cultural interrogation. So it was a film about that kind of ambivalence, I suppose, of wanting to be engaged with the arts, wanting to be engaged with ideas, but also feeling inhibited in some way, and a bit lost about where to start, where to begin, because it's not always a very fertile environment for that sort of trajectory in Australia. So it was definitely had its origins in a feeling of confusion and a lack of direction, and a sense of broader cultural reflection, but one that wasn't resolved in any way.
So is Ray impersonation of yourself, maybe?
Yeah, in a sense, but also a collection of people I met. I felt like a lot of other people that I met. I wasn't different to others in a certain respect. So I could put a lot of myself into that character, but there were certainly things there that were pretty typical of mid-20s. Yeah, people in film sort of adjacent, positions. Not maybe having studied film, but not having moved into the film industry, which is actually kind of a very conservative place in Australia, and dominated by, I guess it's just more technically and commercially oriented. So if you're not interested in that so much, but you are interested in film, you can end up floating around a lot. So I'm wondering whether you're ever gonna, whether that's something you're just gonna give up and go and get a job somewhere else. So yeah, it was a blend of all of those things.
So you didn't study film, you just said, but watching the film, for me, there was a lot of, I wouldn't say influences, but maybe references to cinema, or a lot of films I've seen, like the character of Ray, which is in a way sort of passive and observant, would nearly start from the Buster Keaton or the Jacques Tati type of character. The way you're shooting is also a little bit like Romerian in the situation, but even like a Aung San Suu also type of situation and interaction with people. So it didn't seem to me like a film that was coming out of nothing. I felt it was the child of like a history of cinema and different point of view and entrance. So I was surprised to hear that you didn't study cinema, but I guess you could be just
oh no, sorry, I did study. Yeah, no, I did study film at UTS in Sydney, and then I went to Melbourne after that to work with another Australian filmmaker, Amiel Wilson, and that's went to Melbourne Cinematography a lot, which is kind of one of the really strong long-standing film institutions in Australia that has such a big, is at the heart of film culture in Australia. But yeah, the film is, I guess, one benefit of coming back and having a long period to reflect on a film project that didn't work out was having a lot of time to watch films. And it is interesting, a lot of the comparisons to Romer, and I love his films, but I was probably watching a lot more Rivette around the time that I was writing the script. And I really, what I really like about his films is that sense of a kind of mystery that has no center or origin. It's just something in the texture of the air, and and a reality, and the closer you get to something, the further away you get from it. That was something that I really always loved about Rivette's films. But I also love Romer's films too, and Hong Sang-soo, particularly his early films. I was watching a lot of in the years around when I was writing the script. The Power of Kangwon Province, I just adore that film, and on the occasion of Remembering the Turning Gate, I adore him. So that comparison is one I won't shy away from. And sort of just have taken so much inspiration from him.
So the film is sort of divided in 3 episodes, or structured in 3 parts. And it seems nearly like a circular progression to going back to the beginning with Ray by the beach. Did you feel that Ray was growing up or changing a lot, like emotionally, romantically, professionally, or is it just like going back to being himself?
I would say not, and that was very deliberate, maybe for 2 reasons. I think sometimes in film, an interest in drama as a as a way of engaging audiences can lead to a certain kind of sometimes perverse interest in development, character development, and this sort of enlightenment that a film capturing someone's radical evolution from one state of mind or moral position to another. And I am frustrated a lot of the time when I see those sorts of films, because I think it's so unrealistic. It's so rare for people to have those developments. I think continuity is, people grow and those sorts of things, but films are often about a pretty short period of time, and in those periods it's so rare for people to have these huge shifts in their mental orientation. So I'm more interested in characters that don't necessarily have, we see a process in motion, but not a huge development. And I think with someone, like the Ray character, there's a slice of someone thinking about things. There's no conclusions reached and no grand kind of leap forward. But that also for me was connected to something about Australia culturally too. I think we're a country that practices a kind of active forgetfulness. There's a great anthropologist, Stanner, W.E.H. Stanner, who wrote a lot about, I guess, Indigenous Australians, but in the context of white Australia. There's a history here that white Australia actively kind of looks to turn away from and turn towards a present, but a present that is often quite vacuous and dishonest, because it doesn't actually take into account everything that all the things that have led to where we are. So due to that, I think we do end up repeating, that there's a kind of a loop that we're stuck in to a degree in Australian culture, politically, culturally, however you want to look at it. And it's very frustrating to see a lot of the discourse in Australia just repeat the same, go over and over again the same ground. So it felt appropriate in making a film that was reflecting on that, for characters to not have grand developments, because we really don't have much to show for in that respect. Our generation, it does feel like we're treading water a bit, and that's very upsetting sometimes. And there's a kind of melancholy in the film, I think, that maybe speaks to that. But I guess those were deliberate decisions, not to have Ray. It's interesting that maybe it was something that you thought was unclear, and I suppose that's good in a way. But I did want there to be a sense of Ray, that kind of full circle, because I don't think we've earned the right culturally yet to have these narratives of grand progress. I think we're pretty far away from that.
Well, I mean, the film plays with different genres, because on the surface, it's like nearly like a romantic comedy to a buddy comedy to situational comedy. But obviously, you talk a lot about culture and the history of Australia in a way more subtle way. So maybe it's not right in your face. It's just loads of little clues and things that explain what's going on in Australia and the creation of the country, or the brutal creation of the country. Like starting with the opening sequence with the paintings showing the boats and the indigenous population really small in the background being slowly overtaken. There's a lot of different reference to the history with England and the Commonwealth and the Prince Charles of the Mug and the Queen Mother in different colors, the coin and like a lot of, and then obviously at the end of the film, in the end credits, the film is dedicated to the land of the indigenous tribes that were from there. But it's true that it's not resolved at all in the film, because even when there's the tours, the guides, and someone asks, what could be a stupid question was just like, where are the indigenous people? And that's not even answered. It's just like she goes away because she sees a friend. So that's it's like, oh, let's talk about something. And no, it's just like it goes away. But I really, really enjoyed the way you managed to talk about white privilege and the way the culture is not shared, but also very weirdly displayed, specifically in the film. I don't want to accuse any Australians not having any culture. I mean, what you're talking about, but
feel free to accuse.
it is rarely seen in Australian cinema. I mean, you can learn about it in documentaries or in books, but in fiction films, it's not something that's often talked about. I mean, it's been talked about in a few famous films, but usually I wouldn't see it like this. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about this aspect, though you touched upon it earlier.
Yeah, it's something that I guess again was deliberate. I think like what you're talking about in those aspects being background elements or elements from the details that are part of the set or part of the background or incidental parts of dialogue that aren't actually important to the story. I feel like that was an accurate representation of how these things invade day-to-day life. As someone who identifies as a person who is conscious of and cares about improvement in these issues politically, but at the end of the day is a colonizer. I am this is a colonial film. It's a colonial artistic statement in the same way that William Bradley was a colonial artist, painting his impressions of the landscape when he arrived. We haven't. There were never treaties. There was never any proper coming to terms with Indigenous people in Australia. So I think that makes Australian people very uncomfortable, and the history of Australian politics is really interesting. And whenever there has been a push towards some kind of greater acknowledgement of the history, but also of potentially looking at an alternative future, there's a huge pushback from people who feel very threatened by that. And I also really understand that, because if you've just been born into a place, but something in your essence is criminal and in a way shouldn't be there, that's existentially extremely threatening too. So it's some we're going to have to find a way forward, but I felt like in the film to address that directly, there's a lot of films that do that already, I think, and novels and artworks and journalists. There is a part of Australian culture that's very active in that space, but just for me, it didn't feel like. I was interested in that in-between zone of someone who's conscious of these things, but also still essentially part of the foundation of the problem. How that plays out in day-to-day life, how we block out those things, which maybe people are posting on Facebook or speaking at a dinner party about how they feel about these things, but in their day-to-day life, there's a certain amount of just putting your head down and getting on with things, because it's just otherwise you go a bit insane. So I wanted it to be something that was on the walls, but not right in the center of frame all the time, and that just felt like a more honest way to talk about how this actually manifests in real life for white, comfortable, privileged white Australians. And in terms of why this isn't seen in other Australian films, it's a good question. I don't know why. There's been a huge push for diversity in Australian art making, and I think and just cultural more broadly, and that's excellent. But there hasn't been much of a conversation about self, like a kind of self-interrogation for white Australians, particularly who've grown up in the eastern suburbs and also in cities like Sydney, you know, the affluent parts of the cities, the kinds of people that still run the cultural organizations. The quotas haven't been brought in for the boards and for the directors and executives. It's been brought in for the artists. So I think there's a certain Australian tendency to find a way to pivot away or to avoid the really difficult confronting questions, because there's no easy answers for them. To have like a positive portrait of migrants is something achievable and something we can go, okay, we can do that and put that on screen, and then everyone feels good about it. But to reflect on an issue which points back towards white Australia in an extremely uncomfortable way with no clear solution, that's not something that the majority of Australia has much of an appetite for. So it just, funding opportunities aren't there for things like that. At least in my experience, they haven't been, and they don't seem to be. So yeah, it's a good question. I hope there's more, because I think until we can really talk more directly and be a little braver in talking about things that aren't easy, then we're probably going to continue repeating a lot of just stuck in this loop.
Did you feel that it was you were creating additional difficulties when you were writing the script in trying to keep a certain very light tone in Ray's daily life? There's a lot of humor in the dialogues too, and keeping a more realist setting with a more political aspect to the film. Like, did you have to juggle a lot as a writing stage?
Yes, and I actually think that the writing was the easy part. I wrote a lot of things in that I felt gestured towards or indicated towards these things, probably more than I knew were ever going to be in the film. Actually, the really hard part was, and shooting them was fine too, because just, you know, we just got them. But the hard part was in the edit, and that actually took a really long time working out what the balance was with this, because it's very too far one way or the other, and it would be lost. To pushing it too hard was a mistake, and when then going the other direction in kind of erasing the tracks a bit and being too subtle about it, then it just, you know, it wasn't there, and it felt like just a rom-com. So that actually took a really long time to work out the balance with that. And the opening credits helped a lot, I think, in framing that, and that came quite late. That was an idea that came, sort of out of frustration, because every time I put more into the film, the close collaborators I was getting feedback from were saying, oh, it's heavy-handed, and I pulled back, and then it was empty. But I think that framing at the start really is sort of really direct in framing it in a certain way. And even though there's no reference, no obvious link, but I think it does change the way you sort of start the film and then see everything through that lens afterwards. So that did help a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a way it could nearly give you a reference to the crazy house that's coming later with all the painting, different type of paintings. But I mean, you know, sometimes as a viewer you see different things depending how you see the film. So we credit you for things that maybe you are not even thinking about it, but we think you
exactly.
didn't.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the casting? Because I wasn't familiar with any of the actors. Ray is quite amazing. He has a dialogue delivery that's wonderful. The line when he says, "I had bad bottles for 2 weeks," like it just really, really cracked me up because it's so deadpan. And Alice is amazing too, but one of the hidden stars, I think David, like the father of the bride, Also, he has really, really good dialogue. So I don't know if it's any part improvised, if it came from him, or maybe everything was very written, but it's very precisely written, and the dialogues are quite outstanding.
They all contributed in a huge way. The script I worked on for a long time, but they were written for people for the most part. Greg Zimbalist, who plays David in the house, I wrote the part with him in mind. I'd worked with him in a short film before, and I think if anyone else had played that part, it wouldn't have been a comedy at all. It would have just been a strange and uncomfortable and probably just not good to watch. He has, he captures the aggressively sort of, the aggressive hospitality of like a lot of Australian men, where you're welcomed in, but it's on the sort of that dominant male on their terms, and alcohol is a part of it. And he has
You're drunk.
he has a way of just speaking that in some ways it's not acting, but in other ways it's brilliant because it's on cue. I couldn't imagine casting him as a sort of, professor or a romantic, father figure or anything else. But for that, he has a genius in ad-libbing. There is a degree of it, but it's mostly just in softening up some of the edges, I guess, with the dialogue and inserting swear words and just making it sound natural. So he I owe so much to Greg and how I met him. He's not an actor. I mean, he is, because he's amazing, but he doesn't come from an acting background. He's my younger brother's primary school best friend. Greg is his dad. And when I was making my first short film, he heard about it and said that he'd always wanted to act. And most of the time when you hear things like this, you're like, oh God, this is going to be painful, like, and embarrassing for both of us. And he was the first person I ever had contact with in that kind of way. And he was just amazing. So I was like, I can't believe it felt like God was involved somehow in bringing us together. But Ray was, Alice is a trained actor. She studied in Western Australia, and she brought all of that to the role. And yeah, when we auditioned, it was just like straight away, she really understood the subtlety and that kind of ambivalence in her character. I kind of wanted there to be a mystery about whether she likes or hates this person and what she wants from him. And I think she just, without even being directed, just instantly got that. And she brought also just a calmness to the whole process, which I think for a lot of the non-actors around her, they really benefited from. And Fergus was another miracle. He's a good friend of a friend, and I'd actually asked him if he'd help me with the casting video. So he was actually filming the casting, and we'd had a pretty terrible day of actors coming in, and none of them were right. And we were doing all the casting on our own. We didn't have a casting agent or anything, and we're only about 3 weeks out from shooting. So I was really thinking, in the next 2 days or so, if we don't find the Ray, then we're going to have to delay the production by 6 months while we go back and really, we can't keep going with someone who's not right. Such an important, it's the film, so that character. So we had a bad day, and at the end I was like, well, I guess we've got the room for another hour. Fergus, do you want to step in front of camera? And he got, and after like reading the first, I couldn't believe how perfect it was. I couldn't believe that I just hadn't thought of it. Like, we'd been there all day and the day before, and I hadn't thought of him. But he brought a quality to it that, again, I didn't have to direct him, and which is amazing for someone who's never been really in front of camera before. He got that kind of innocent but complicit sort of, you know, you hate him, you love him, you're frustrated with him, you sympathize with him, and he just managed to walk that line in a really effortless way, I felt. So Fergus Wilson was, yeah, a pleasure to work with, and love to work with him again. It's so fun, that process when it works out, and so terrifying when it feels like it's not working out, which we certainly, yeah, it was a lot of panic happening about a month out from where we had no cast at all, but it worked out. So
yeah, no, I think it did work out very well. There was a very good balance, but yeah, I was curious about the writing of the dialogue, because I find them extremely funny, but very precise, and a very short amount of time, and short delivery. And it's not always something that comes out really well. And especially when the humor type is sometimes difficult to translate, but I thought it worked out perfectly well. But there's another aspect of the film that's quite remarkable and very memorable. It's like, you know, the house in the banker district, which I don't know if it's a real district with nouveau riche or rich people like from there, but the art that you see in the house, and the whole way the house is set up. So can you talk about maybe the process of creating the house and the scene and your collaboration? Did you have an art director to come up with everything?
Yes,
you were probably involved too?
Wonderful art director, Milena Stoyanovska, but that house was, as you know, as we found it, really. We were really fortunate with the permission we were given to use that house. I'd been to that house sometime around when I was writing the script. The art gallery that I was working at, someone else who was working there had a connection through an artist friend of hers to the person who owned this house, Kate Smith, who's an art consultant and buyer of art, I guess. And it was like a small party, and I found myself there, really felt very out of place. But just the house was, as you see it in the film, was as I saw it, and I was just, I'd never been anywhere like that before. And I guess it wasn't something when I was writing, thought, oh, we're going to go back to that house, but I couldn't help but have that house in mind when I was writing the script. And then there was a period in pre-production where I was starting to think about what we're gonna, looking at renting a place like that. It could be like $50,000 for 4 days, So that was starting to become a problem. And I thought, well, maybe I should actually try and get in touch with this person again, who I did meet, but she wouldn't remember me. But she was, Kate was just so supportive and lovely, and I couldn't believe it, really. She just said yes straight away, and the art in the house was just as she had it on the walls, because she's selling a lot of art. She's always got a lot jammed in that's about to be sold or moved on. And the Queens you mentioned earlier, that was something that came out of the fact that we shot with the Blue Queen in the first round of shooting, and then when we came back to shoot there again, it was gone, and we were panicking and working out if we could do kind of color replacement or something, and then we realized, maybe we might as well just write this in. It could be like a nice turn for the scene, and that ended up being, it's one of my favorite moments of the film. But we didn't have to do much with that house. But the location is important, because Vaucluse is one of the wealthiest suburb, probably the wealthiest suburb in the whole country. And I guess Sydney's history with, just in terms of waterfront property from the very, very beginning, with the officer class arriving in Sydney. And the original plan for Sydney as a colony was for it to be agricultural, and also a penal colony, as you know, as everyone kind of knows, it was a prison system. But very quickly that plan was derailed because trade and speculation in property became the only thing anyone was interested in, and people quickly realized how beautiful the harbour was. And so for anyone with access to capital, getting a place near the water and starting to build a nice house was Sydney. That obsession with property has never left from that early, from those origins. So in some ways it's Sydney's curse, this obsession with property, where no one can afford a house. In Sydney, the average house price is like $2 million just for a 2-bedroom place somewhere near the city. It's out of control now. But yeah, because that, I suppose, that represents a lot of that captures, that tend to capture for me a lot of what colonial culture means, and that connection to the harbour too, which is so iconic, was something I thought would be good for the film. So yeah, Vaucluse was always the place that I felt like that should be set. We had some options for out, more coastal, like far out of Sydney, but it didn't feel quite right. It needed to be at like the heart of wealth and power in Sydney. So we were really lucky to get that house.
I can't believe it's a real house. I mean, like a real setting with the art in it. And I'm glad you talked about the mystery of the blue and the pink queen. Perfect. But it was very well. But I mean, also the scene where, like, wasn't she blue before?
Yeah.
Pretty funny. When it comes about. So talking about the visual aspect of the film, can you also talk a little bit about your collaboration with a cinematographer and the choice of the color palette, which also seems to me there's often a little dot of red coming around, not in every frame, but very often with something red that just pop out on the screen, while the rest is usually on the bluish green natural color, so.
Yeah, Dimitri Saunders, the cinematographer, was one of the first people involved, and I'd worked with him on a job at a point where I was writing the script, but also starting to look towards pre-production. This is really even before I had a producer on board, but just knowing how important having the right person involved in that role would be for a film where we had not much money. It would really have to be someone who cared about the project, and was passionate, had a lot of shared interest, I guess, in the aesthetic vision. And Dimitri is just a dream to work with. He's just such a intelligent, committed, but yeah, also aesthetically we were just so aligned in our interests. I think a lot of cinematographers, the idea of having the camera just sort of sitting on the tripod and pointing, and then sort of standing back and just waiting till the director says cut, it for them feels like they're not being respected or valued. But for Dimitri, that was like, he loved the idea of working that way. And for him, that meant being able to put a huge amount of preparation into lighting and composition, but particularly lighting. There was a lot of work we did also with the first AD, just practically planning time of day in a really precise way. For this scene, close up means we're going to be facing this, northeast. That means we need to be there at between 9 and 10 doing that shot. So that meant we had to go and visit that place a lot, many times to work out how we were going to make that work with the rest of the scenes. There was it ended up being a huge amount of prep work we did and scheduling to make all of those things work for Dimitri. Because we weren't using lights either. It was very kind of stripped back, sort of, we had a gaffer, Charles Gray, who was just working with kind of cutters and bouncers, and don't have that background, so I'm probably not using the right words for these things. But yeah, there were not really much electric, LED lights or anything that we used. So it was mostly manipulating natural light, which meant being very careful about time of day and the angle, into which we shot. The whole thing was backlit basically, which was something Dimitri was really hard on from an early point. So it was a challenge, because if something went wrong, if an actor for one reason or another couldn't be there, or the scene wasn't working and the sun moved past where it was meant to be and it was suddenly front lit, it was kind of non-negotiable that we would find another time to shoot it. Having it backlit, I think, does give everything a sort of volume that really gives a huge amount, to the film. Like, it makes everything feel, this kind of soft. Well, the softness was another choice with the lenses and things, but yeah, this kind of this very full and three-dimensional feeling where you really feel the light sort of passing through foliage, and Dimitri was an enormous part of the film for all those creative reasons and conceptual reasons, but also just the amount of, I don't think anyone put more time into the film than Dimitri. We just did so much driving around together, looking for locations and working out the right locations, and he's been it was such a privilege to meet him and work with him. So, and can't wait to work with him on more films going forward. Another person who the film wouldn't have existed without him.
We're gonna run out of time, but before we leave, I wanted to ask you what was next for the film, because I don't know if the movie has been shown in Australia. I mean, it's been some film festival, but if it's going to be screened publicly, and what is next for you, if you're working on another film already, or if you're just still thinking of Friends and Strangers.
So we do have a screening in Australia. I can't say when that's going to be, because the program hasn't been announced yet. There is a screening in the second half of the year, it has been. It's been something I tried to have a break from this film, because it was just doing the writing and directing and the editing, and then a lot of the post-production too, like doing the online and then just managing the delivery of all the materials to the festivals and all that kind of stuff was it has felt non-stop in a funny kind of way. So I went away for a month to visit my sister up in Darwin, which is like in the northern part of Australia, the last month, which was really amazing. And on what's next, it's a good question. It sort of financial stuff is an unfortunate part of it. I'm not quite sure where all that's going to land with funding for the next thing, but I'm hopeful that I can do it the same way as I did this one, which is just to self-fund, and a few things would need to land for that. But it was just such a pleasure to be able to work that way, because it takes so many of the anxieties, I think, that filmmakers feel when there's all these invisible kind of masters that you're not sure really what they think, but they're giving you directions on what you should be doing or what they think you need to do, conditions of funding and rounds of approval for it takes that away, which I think is really actually is a really important thing for artistic integrity. So I'm hoping to be able to fund the next one. We'll see in the next year, where it's not a cheap thing. But we did shoot a part of Friends and Strangers that was in the script but didn't actually make it in the film, and it's like a 20 to 30 minute section, which I love. It was like a dream sequence that was a bit crazy in the context of the rest of the film. It was a long year in 2020 coming, letting go of that part of the film. I really was reluctant to, but it was undeniable once it was out that the film was working much better. But I really, because that part is quite distinct from the rest, and I really, on its own, really love it. I'm keen to use that as a sort of maybe the first 25 minutes of the next film, and have been thinking without writing, but thinking about where the film could go, another film could go from there. So I'm hopeful for being able to shoot that next year, all things going to plan.
Okay, so that's not really taking a break. You're still kind of living with friends and strangers in a way. But maybe it'd be easier to get finances in place based on doing a second film. And I think your first film is quite amazing. So I just hope it will help in getting the second film. So congratulations. And thank you again for sharing Friends and Strangers and talking about the making of the film. I wish you best of luck with this one and all the next one. And it was really great to have you part of New Director, New Film this year. So thank you so much, James.
Thank you, Florence. It's such a pleasure to be involved. And on behalf of the whole team, we're so honored.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.